What if I told you that there was a time when coffins exploded, churchyards were overflowing, and people danced on the dead? Hi, my name is the Gentle Fae, and whilst I usually stream all things cute and cozy, I'm also working on a PhD on death in the 19th century. So, in honor of spooky season being nearly upon us, I thought, why not do a presentation on that? So, if you are a fan of all the dark and the macabre, I suggest you stick around for fun facts about Victorian Death and Mourning. Okay, this looks entirely too cutesy. Just give me 1 second while I sort this out. Fun facts about Victorian Death and Mourning. That's better, isn't it? Well then, I promised you exploding coffins, didn't I? During the 1830s and 40s, lead coffins gained popularity as men called resurrection men started digging open graves and stealing the corpses within in order to sell them to anatomical theatres and schools, so future doctors and surgeons could dissect them. A lot of people weren't exactly keen on their corpses being cut apart, and what better way to prevent theft than having your corpse bolted shut in a lead coffin? And while it kept the resurrection man out, it also kept everything else in. The gases and putrid body essences that flowed out of the body had nowhere to go, eventually becoming so concentrated that it caused the coffin to implode with a rather large bang. Apparently it scared the living hell out of quite a few graveyard visitors who had decided to wander through the graves on a lovely evening. Now the undertakers were a clever bunch, so they ordered the coffins to have a little hole in them in which they could insert a portable tap. They then hired so-called coffin tappers to go about the homes of the well-to-do with a bucket, insert the tap, and extract all the goo from the coffin. This way churchyards were no longer shaken up by the occasional loud bang, provided of course the tappers didn't forget the tap. Speaking of graveyards, these were not always the nicely curated places that they are nowadays. Indeed, when the Industrial Revolution happened during the late 18th century or early 19th century, a lot of people moved to the larger cities. And while city planners keenly expanded the town to accommodate for the influx of people, they forgot that these people could also die. The result? Overflowing graveyards. On this slide is one of the best illustrations of this, which is from a novel called Bleak House by Charles Dickens. However, I suppose my favourite story I encountered is by a man called George Walker, who regales how a man in Southwark walked across a churchyard where a partly decomposed body had just been moved to a shallower grave, only slightly covered with earth. The man accidentally stepped upon it, the loosened skin peeled off, he slipped forward and had nearly fallen into the grave. And as churchyards overflowed, so did the vaults. Whilst we might shy away from too close proximity to corpses, the Victorians apparently sometimes used it as a feature to draw in the crowds. Such was the case with Enon Chapel in London. After having suffered under the mismanagement of a minister who crammed the vault as full of dead bodies as possible to make a quick buck, it was then rented to new tenants in 1844, who placed a layer of brick on the original wooden floor, laid down new wooden floorboards and opened the space as a low dancing saloon for teetotalers, cheerfully advertising dances on the dead, as well as gambling. An old leaflet stated, Enon Chapel, dancing on the dead, admission 3d, no lady or gentleman admitted unless wearing shoes and stockings. Their pursuit must have been profitable, as the church would not change hands for another 3 years, when it came into the possession of George Walker, a man who was an advocate for burial reform and was outraged by the ill treatment of the bodies in the cellar. He proclaimed that he intended to give those who had been interred within the chapel a proper burial in a nearby churchyard. Although this seemed like a noble cause, Walker decided to turn the disinterment into a public spectacle, by inviting the public to come and watch as the exhumations took place. According to the Evening Mail, Walker even placed an attendant at the chapel gate, who walked about with skulls in his hand, apparently with the view of increasing the excitement of the persons assembled outside. The chapel became quite a tourist attraction, as over 6,000 people toured the chapel during the exhumation process. The Victorians clearly weren't very scared of being close to dead bodies, which is also reflected in their mourning culture. Especially during the middle of the 19th century, it was all the rage to wear jewellery that contained or was entirely made out of the hair of a lost loved one. Now, for the final fun fact that I will leave you with, I will turn to another favourite keepsake of the Victorians: the post-mortem photograph. Now, due to Twitch TOS, I won't be able to show you any actual images of this, so I had to use an illustration to give you an idea of what a Victorian photo studio might look like. But if you do a quick Google search, you will be able to find plenty of examples. Just ignore the ones with ghostly apparitions or severed heads, as those are fabricated. Now, as photography became more affordable, a lot of people still didn't have the means to get a photograph of their loved ones in life, so they instead had to have them made while they were dead. But of course, no one wants to have a picture of an ugly corpse in their house, so photographers had to get quite creative. Frequently, they would take the image of a corpse in the bed, as if they were merely sleeping. But for some, it almost became an art form to have the deceased person look as normal and lifelike as possible. They dressed the deceased up in their Sunday best and had them sit in familiar poses or surrounded by family members. You have to respect the termination of the latter, as they had to sit still for up to 30 minutes next to the dead body of the deceased. Some photographers even went so far as to paint the pictures to add colour and to add eyes on top of the closed eyelids. Now, one would expect that these peculiar photographs were then carefully tucked away in a family album somewhere, never to be seen again. But that's not quite true. They were frequently included in the letters or cards that were sent to loved ones and relatives to inform them of the deceased's passing, so they too could have an image to remember them by. And with that last fact, I shall leave you. I hope you've enjoyed listening to some of the odd bibs and bobs I've encountered during my research. Feel free to reach out if you've got any questions, or let me know if anyone would be interested in me turning this into a series, as there is a lot more where this came from. This was The Gentle Fae. Stay cozy, and in this case, alive and spooky, my friends.